Hi, everybody. My name is Erik Bleich. I'm a professor of political science at Middlebury College, and I'm the Executive Committee Chair of the Council for European Studies. The CES is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. It's an international professional organization that fosters research, teaching, and public knowledge about contemporary Europe. It's probably best known for its annual International Conference of Europeanists, which unfortunately won't take place this year. So I invite you all to join us next year in Reykjavik, Iceland in June. It should be quite nice. Partly because of the loss of our annual conference this year, we launched the CES Insights webinar series this spring. This is designed to cover topics of pressing concern in contemporary Europe. Today's topic is, do Black Lives Matter in Europe? This is obviously one of the most pressing questions in Europe, with links to the movements taking place right now in the United States and elsewhere around the world. We have three distinguished panelists today, one of whom will also serve as the moderator for the discussion. Jean Beaman is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research is primarily ethnographic and focuses on race, ethnicity, racism, international migration, and state-sponsored violence in both France and the United States. She's the author of Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. She is a member of the Executive Committee of the Council for European Studies and has graciously volunteered to moderate the discussion as well as to serve as a panelist. Terri Gibbons is a political scientist and CEO founder of the Center for Higher Education Leadership. She founded the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and her research has focused on the radical right, immigration politics, and anti-discrimination policy in Europe. She's the author of numerous books and articles on these topics, and her latest publication is the textbook, Immigration in the 21st Century. Kennetta H serves as director of the Stephen Lawrence Research Center at De Montfort University in Leicester, England, where she is also a reader in history. Her previous appointment was as Associate Professor of History and co-director of the African and African American Studies program at East Carolina University in the United States. Her research interests include Black British history, mechanisms of state violence, transnational race politics, Black women's history, archives of Black Europe, and anti-racist movements for citizenship, recognition, and social justice throughout the African diaspora. Her publications include the book, London is the Place for Me, Black Britons, Citizenship, and the Politics of Race. I'll turn over the podium to these three scholars in a moment, and I'll turn off my camera. While I'm in the background, I will serve as the Q&A moderator, so if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. You'll see me again at the 40-minute mark where I'll come back in, and I'll do my best to group some of those questions to make it easier for panelists to respond to them. You can pose questions at any time, though we hope you understand that we might not be able to respond to all of them in the 60 minutes that we have together today. So with that said, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Erik. So I'm so thrilled to be part of this conversation, to be moderating this conversation about these crucial topics, and specifically with two scholars whose work I've used in my own work and really admire and really enjoy. So I want to just sort of say a few words about kind of why this conversation, why now? You know, do Black Lives Matter in Europe? So I think we can think about this and in terms of recent incidents of state-sponsored violence, of state violence, of police violence against Black individuals across, throughout Europe and then also in the United States. But I think we can also think about it more broadly, or perhaps we can bring this up in the discussion of the sort of, the relevance of the global pandemic and how that has disproportionately affected Black lives across Europe and again, across the United States and elsewhere. So just a quick background about me and my work. So I'm a scholar, I'm a sociologist of race and racism in France. And partly why I'm really thrilled to have this conversation, one of the reasons why I'm thrilled to have this conversation is to really, center the study of race and racism in Europe, which is often, for various reasons, both legitimate and illegitimate, marginalized or put to the sidelines, right? And so my own interest in France stems from a longstanding, learning of the French language, but also just my own ethnographic work and interest in dynamics of migration and race and ethnicity in France. And particularly what I think is interesting about France, and I think this is true in many other European contexts, the UK maybe being a slight exception, is this sort of predominance of a denial of race and racism, right? So, in contrary to the kind of American style of identity politics, of multiculturalism, what's super fascinating, or what's been fascinating to me for decades at this point, in terms of France and just Europe more generally, is this overstanding dynamic or ideology of colorblindness, right? This idea that sort of race is not here, it's there, and there is usually the United States or at least outside of Europe. And so I think it's really interesting in this moment to both think about that, to center the study of race and racism in Europe, but also to think about sort of, how that operates vis-a-vis some of the things that have happened in the last few weeks. I think we can think about, again, the incidents of police violence, but also just more generally thinking about the different statues, like Leopold in Belgium or Colston in Bristol falling down, right? And so this sort of like acknowledgement, however superficial, of these histories and legacies of white supremacy, of these histories of colonialism and slavery. So I think part of what we're trying to do with this webinar more generally is think about the study, or center the study of race and racism and understanding both contemporary dynamics in Europe, but also sort of historical dynamics in Europe. And so this is part of the reason why there's now a newly constituted research network in CES on race and racism. So I encourage all of you who are signing up to be new members of CES or renewing your membership to sign up for that network, because we're really trying to build this kind of intellectual community around people, people across Europe, people who study different parts of Europe in different ways around these topics. And the first thing we did was some of us that are interested in this topic was have a session on race and racism at last year's CES conference. So we're hoping that we can continue to have sessions at forthcoming CES conferences around these topics. Okay, so I think just to kind of bring in a few questions more generally about sort of how I want to think about this topic for today's conversation is, one, thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, the denial of race and racism in Europe and how that sort of is still the case. And by denial of race and racism, I should be clear that I mean sort of at a sort of state governmental level. I don't mean that individuals themselves or Black individuals themselves, more poignantly, are denying race and racism. I'm thinking about, so, in the context of France, the ongoing debate about ethnic statistics, right? And sort of having like census level categories or not about race. So thinking about denial in that sense. And then I think also sort of, as I alluded to with the question of, statues that have been taken down in recent weeks, is this question of sort of, memory or remembrance or legacies of colonialism, of slavery, and how that's sort of implicated in the contemporary dynamics that we're seeing when we try to understand the lives of Black individuals across Europe. And then also to think about sort of, what's interesting in the question around police violence or state-sponsored violence, and to think about sort of the global movements that are happening right now that we're just seeing. I mean, there's like, there was a massive protest in Paris last Saturday. There's another one, and a massive protest in Paris a couple of weeks ago. And so I think it's also helpful for us to think about, or try to discuss, hopefully we can discuss, like, why now, why this moment, right? Because of course, in France, in the UK, thinking about Stephen Lawrence, thinking about, Mark Duggan, thinking about these other examples of Black people that have been killed by the state, this is not a new occurrence, not in the United States, and of course not in Europe. So I think it's also helpful to think about, what is it about this contemporary moment that we're in that's sort of bringing together some of these mass mobilizations that we're seeing around the youth. So I want to start, just to kind of open up the conversation, with Terri Gibbons, because I know you've been studying just anti-discrimination policies, immigration, in various European contexts for years. So I would just sort of turn it to you to kind of open us up on this.
Yes, I'm the senior, what we call the Moosehead Scholar.
Yeah, I did not say that.
Anyway, actually, and I wanted to start just by talking about, I'm going to share my screen in a minute here, but I started, like Jean, I studied French starting in middle school all the way through college. And my first experience with race in Europe was going on a study abroad trip when I was an undergrad at Stanford in 1986. And for those of us who study the radical right, 1986 was a critical year. And actually, the funny thing is that I really didn't put those pieces together until I was working on a book recently. It's like, wait a second, I was in France in 1986. And I arrived in April, right after Jean-Marie Le Pen's National Front Party had a significant success in a by-election. or actually not even a by-election, in a general election. And I remember, going there at the time and thinking, oh my gosh, France is just, is this national front and radical right and anti-immigrant and so on. But, I mean, it's very complicated in France, the whole situation with race, and we can get into that. But at the time, I was really interested. There was the Touche pas mon pot movement that was just getting started, and I was really interested in the fact that you were starting to see these mobilizations around race, and so people, Black, French, and so on. But I also went to Germany at the time and was very interested in what was going on with the Turkish people and so on. So actually, I when I went back to graduate school, I actually started off saying I wanted to study the radical right, because that was something that was on the rise in the early 1990s as well, when I went back to graduate school. So I'm just going to do a really quick screen share. So my first book, Voting Radical Right in Western Europe, I initially was really interested in the issue of race in Europe and decided to come at it from the anti-immigration situation. And because there was there was movements on both sides, both the radical right and the immigrant and people of color in Europe starting to create their own movements, there was a lot going on in the mid 1990s. And so I focused on the success of radical right, or the lack thereof, of radical right parties across Europe. My main focus was on France, Germany, Austria, and Denmark. And the funny thing is, and coming back to this issue of denial, a lot of people were telling me, oh, why are you studying the radical right? They're just a flash in the pan. They're going to disappear. And I was like, well, it's my dissertation. And I turned into a book, and, it's still getting a lot of traction, of course, because, it was one of the first books, certainly by an American, on the radical right in Europe. And we can, if people have questions about that, we can talk about it more. But I wanted to move on. One of the things we did, when after the election of Barack Obama, was look at immigrant politics, which there hasn't been much of a study of, how do people of different races in Europe, their politics, do they vote, are they, and I became interested in this because as I was doing the research for my book, next book, Legislating Equality, it was clear that there was a lot of discussion going on around how immigrants vote, and it ties into this whole issue of how we've seen the decline of the left as we've seen the rise of the radical right. And there was this huge expectation when I was studying this stuff in the late 90s, early 2000s, that if they could mobilize immigrants and get them to vote, that it would help the left parties. Well, the reality is we've seen the decline of the left. The Parti Socialiste in France has just not been doing well, and there's all kinds of studies going on right now across Europe about why the left is in decline. And then my book, Legislating Equality, actually came out of my study of the radical right, because in 1999, Jörg Haider's party, the Austrian Freedom Party, was successful, and that led to the passage of the Racial Equality Directive. And at the time, there were a lot of left parties in government, and so the passage of the RED at the EU level was done relatively quickly as a response to the rise of the Freedom Party in Austria. But then there was a shift, and you had these conservative parties that came in, and they all pretty much undermined, both in terms of budgets and just resources, these anti-discrimination bodies that existed, that had to be created after the passage of the RED. And so but at the same time, I was looking at the rise of, in France, for the first time, you were seeing organizations of Black French people, and a greater, acknowledgement of issues of race. And I just remember going to meetings in the early 2000s in Germany in particular, where, I'd be with these different government officials, and they would say things like, well, you in America have, so much experience dealing with race and equality issues, and we just don't have that experience here. And I'm like, thinking to myself, you have had significant people of color in this country since the 1960s. I mean, Germany tends to see itself as like, oh, we're so innocent because, we haven't had these issues. And it's hard for Germany to acknowledge a lot of these issues because of their history, right? And as a political scientist, I tend to focus more on the politics and the policy. But here is where history really comes into play because of this, Germany's sin of the Holocaust and so on. They have a tendency to want to downplay issues of race, which is not necessarily what you would think would happen in this situation. But anyway, so I just wanted to show this. This was a protest I happened to see in Berlin. And so the one thing I will say is that issues of race and immigration are intertwined, especially in a place like Germany that hasn't, besides the Turkish workers who came and have now settled there, hasn't had, didn't have the same colonial legacy because of course they lost their colonies early on. But there still are, a lot of the immigrants are coming to Germany because of the, ability to, get asylum and get jobs and so on, along with the UK, of course. And so we see a lot of people coming to Germany and, large inflows. And this was a protest that was, people were doing because of lack of housing and so on for them. And it says just in Mensch, which for human and gut so. Trying to, basically bring together these ideas around the fact that we are immigrants, but we belong here and we should be able to support ourselves. And I'll just mention there have been incidents of police brutality even in Germany. There was a case when I was there of actually I think an American man who was beaten up by the police, but also radical right. Actually, this whole denial thing is so bad that when there was a neo-Nazi group that was going after Turkish people, it took years for them to figure it out because the police didn't make the connection between these neo-Nazis and what was happening in these attacks. So that's a situation where even, there's the direct police brutality, but the lack of recognition of the anti-Black and anti-Turkish sentiments is actually kept them from being able to track down these attackers. So I'm going to stop there because I know we are want to save time. So thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Terri. Yeah, and I really like the point that you made about sort of thinking about state violence beyond just sort of specific acts of killings, of brutality, but rather sort of broadening our understanding to think about the ways in which the state is sort of marginalized particular individuals, right? And I think that actually also, I think is a nice segue to Kennetta's and your book, London is a Place for Me, which I really love teaching in my graduate seminar early this year, because you actually also talk about this idea of sort of Black immigrants staking a claim to being Black British citizens, right? And so perhaps you can expound on that.
Yeah, sure. And I'll also just sort of share a little bit about kind of my own intellectual genealogy, because I think it's actually really important to think about how I came to study Black life in the UK historically, because I'm very aware now that I am a Black American scholar based in Britain, that pathway is not necessarily there in the UK. And so I don't even know if the possibility for me to do the work that I do would be possible had I actually been trained in the British Academy and educated in the British education system. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah.
And so, part of kind of what sort of shaped my pathway into studying Black British history really began in the context of studying at an HBC at North Carolina Central University. And I think that's really important because that history curriculum there, European history was intimately linked to the histories of the African diaspora in terms of the ways that it was taught. And it was done in a kind of, I hate to use the word normal, but it was a very sort of normalized way in that you could not understand the French Revolution without understanding the Haitian Revolution. You could not understand, abolition, or you could not understand, things like emancipation without, reading both Frederick Douglass, but also Mary Prince. And so, you could not, sort of think about, these moments separated from one another. And so that was a part of, I think, intentionally, interestingly, a part of both my European history training at the undergraduate level, but also my Black history training. So like they had a Black experience sort of generic history course. And again, you learned about sort of traditional kind of, a much more conventional African-American history of Black freedom struggles. But I also was introduced to Claudia Jones in those courses. And that's another sort of central figure that came to play in the work that I do, looking at sort of citizenship struggles or struggles for citizenship rights among Black communities in the UK in the post-World War II period. I think another formative piece that was really crucial in helping to sort of cement my study and work on histories of Europe and the African diaspora, but also Black Britain more specifically, is being trained in a comparative Black history program at Michigan State. So we were intentionally in our sort of, regular seminars sort of forced to think about here and there. And so whereas I went into graduate school actually thinking that I was going to do a much more conventional topic around African-American women's civil rights activism, it was in the context of being trained in a program where we had to ask, you want to study this, but what does that mean in relation to this? Or what does, and not only in terms of people, but in terms of place, in terms of time. And so I was really sort of trained in a context historically to think about those connections. And again, it was in the context of an early seminar in my graduate training where I was just sort of like, okay, these sort of seeds were planted in undergrad. And so I'm going to sort of, where does it take me to think about what was happening with Black people in Britain during the height of what I considered to be at the time, a kind of African-American centered Black freedom struggle. And so that is sort of what created the seeds of my own work on looking at citizenship and race politics in the UK in the post-World War II period, and now transitioning into sort of longer histories of state-sanctioned violence in the UK. And, I think one of the things that's been interesting to hear both of you all talk about this sort of denial of race and racism. And for me as a historian, one of the things I'm very interested in is thinking about how Black lives matter in British history, both in terms of content, but also in terms of methodology, to think about the ways that that provides a kind of methodological tool to actually historicize race and racism and to push back against that kind of deniability. I'm a historian by training, and so I'm kind of biased in terms of all the work that I think, the important work that I think history does. But one of the things that I think history does is it actually gives you the narrative to actually talk systematically about racism. Like it literally, when we're talking about structures around race and racism, we're literally trying to invoke a way to show that there's a pattern, to show that this isn't a one-off, to show that this is not an incident, but that this is part of a longer history. And I actually think historians, in terms of their own political orientations, need to be much more aware of the ways in which history as both practice and content has a very political orientation to it. And I'm very much definitely trying to sort of think about the political work of history in the present. And I think that frames, I think it's a really important point in terms of what we're seeing in this moment or in this particular period, particularly with the debate over the removal of statues. I think at the core of that is this debate over what histories do we want to be told, what histories are absented, what histories haven't been sort of part of the larger public imagination. And so I think that's one of the things that we're reckoning with in this particular moment. And in my own work, I've talked a little bit about, what I think, how I tried to kind of provide kind of an analytical frame to think about that, how that denial works to kind of gaslight the experiences of Black people on the ground in Europe. And I've sort of referred to it as a kind of mystique of British anti-racism, which sort of functions as a sort of conduit of real sort of denial. And in the UK, in the case of Britain, I think it's very much rooted in these kinds of ways in which Britain imagines itself as a kind of abolitionist nation, and the work that they do to sort of, kind of retrofit these narratives about abolition to paint the nation as benevolent towards people of African descent, as innocent, as liberal, as progressive in relation to other places like the UK, like the US. And so again, to me, I see that kind of work in that moment. But one of the things that's really interesting in this moment as well, I went to a Black Lives Matter protest in the city of Leicester, and one of the signs that stands out to me the most is that the racism that killed George Floyd was built in Britain. And so also, again, that kind of way in which the history is, the history of American race and racism is severed from the history of the British Empire. And so I think part of what animates my work is to kind of, disrupt that and to kind of really sort of rethink those connections so that we can better have a real frame of reference to understand why these certain kinds of solidarities are possible, not only in this moment, but also sort of as part of a much longer history of transnational race politics between the US and the UK in particular, which has kind of been the focal point of my work.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for bringing the sort of the insights of history. I mean, I think it's really interesting also as a way to think about sort of how to explain the racism of the present. I mean, I don't know if Terri, if you've had this experience, but, I've been to France, I've spent a lot of time in France over the years, and I can't tell you how many times white French people have told me, okay, so how can France be racist if Josephine Baker moved here, if James Baldwin moved here, if Chester Himes moved here, right? And so I think there's also a sort of both a disavowal of a particular history, but also sort of, picking and choosing which histories to use and use in a particular way to say that, racism is in the United States, or, race discrimination, that's the United States, not Paris, not France, right? And so I think that's part of that. I mean, it's a deliberate obfuscation of this French colonial history, among other things. I don't know if you've had, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so interesting because, the French will be out there. I remember there was a protest about Mumia Abu-Jamal in the late 90s. And, and this newspaper reporter was saying, oh, they're out there protesting because it's an American thing. But then the same person will come home and disregard their Algerian neighbor. And, just the way that the French deal with race is very much like gaslighting.
Right.
I think we all know Rocaille Diallo has just been fighting so hard to get the people in France to understand the issue of race. But I want to come back to what Kennetta was saying in terms of the history. I'm actually working on a book, which my publisher is going to be mad at me because I'm not working on it right this minute. On the roots
part of the process here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm talking about it. The roots, but it's basically, it's exactly what you're talking about, Kennetta, the roots of racism, because I having, spent so much time in Europe and seeing how they use the US as a foil for, oh, we're not racist, look at what's happening in the US. But the reality is, going back to, slavery, I mean, where did these ideas about race come from? And so it's really tracing through history. How do we get these ideas about race? And the US and Europe have been intertwined for centuries around these issues, because the idea of race came from Europe. I mean, there's all, I'm learning a ton of history, Kennetta, so you'll be glad to hear that. But, for political science, it's critical because these ideas did not come out of thin air. And, what we're seeing in terms of policing and so on come from years and years and years. I mean, you can look at the French in Algeria and how they dealt with that. And, Germany, you go back to, obviously, World War II, and, even the citizenship policies that were developed over time came out of, these different historical moments where for Germany, it was trying to, maintain, German, the Germans who were Aussiedler, who lived outside and were left outside of Germany after the war, for France, just all these issues around, being French and what that means. I mean, there was all these debates, as you guys know, and in the early 2000s, who can be French? And then it started in Britain, who can be British, and then who can be German, and the whole, denial or saying that multiculturalism hadn't worked.
Right.
And I know those, he had all the, 3 different leaders in France, Germany, and the UK saying within a space of a few months that multiculturalism had failed. And the funny thing was, I was like, what multiculturalism? But anyway, so there's tons. I mean, I've just had so many experiences where, and actually, I have to say, you can go back to Gary Friedman's original work on France and the UK around immigration and race, and, how the French being mad that he even used the word race in his title. And anyway, and obviously race is a social construct, but the way that people of color are treated you can document, has been very similar across the Atlantic.
Yeah, so that's why I think it's so interesting to study. I mean, kind of as when I'm working on now, to study these sort of global movements of sort of, against anti-Black racism, against police violence, et cetera. Because I think, again, like even if there are differences across different societies, where it's France in the United States or France in the UK, or et cetera, people of color, Black individuals are recognizing some commonalities in how they're treated. And I think relatedly, so treated in terms of the violence, but relatedly treated in terms of sort of the lack of justice that's accorded them. And I think I really liked, Terri, what you just said kind of made me think about this broader question of national belonging, of societal belonging, which is like also sort of part and parcel of what's happening with the state violence, the ways in which the state is sort of reinforcing who can actually be seen as French, who can actually be seen as German, who can actually be seen as British, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, state violence, police brutality is another way, it's another lens to kind of get at some of those questions as well. So maybe we could switch a little. Oh, did you want to say something?
Oh, just one last point is that in terms of violence, we can talk about the kind of history of race riots.
Oh yeah,
obviously.
So that's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, obviously in the UK that goes back to the Windrush.
Right.
Before that as
well. Well, yes. So I mean, do you want to talk about that, Kennetta? Since I raised the topic.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I also definitely think just that history of a kind of the ways in which colonial violence has operated in the metropole is sort of accented again. From in the context of the UK. And I also think, just to both of you all's point about the notion of thinking about needing to reimagine and reconceptualize how we think about what state violence is and how it happens. I think, there is a lot of attention to police violence, but I think in this particular moment, it's interesting to think about, how this moment is being shaped by the dynamics of the disproportionate rates by which Black people around the globe are dying from a global health crisis, but also coupled with that police violence. And I think we cannot disentangle those at all. And we sort of, and actually what that is laying bare is that we need to study state violence in terms of, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do in my next project, is think about how the lack of investment in the infrastructure of the welfare state, which is that lack is also mapped racially or racialized, or the ways in which the welfare state is not built to actually service and do the work for the entirety of the public in which it's supposed to serve, creates the preconditions for certain kinds of encounters with the police state, encounters with the carceral state, and certain kinds of outcomes. So oftentimes, in my view, when we're looking at police violence, and that is certainly the case when we think about the case of George Floyd, we're seeing, an encounter that is set in motion well before we're seeing the final process of something that is a much larger encounter with the failures of the state. And I think that's one of the things I definitely think this moment requires us to kind of reconsider how we think about state violence, that it's not just through the lens of police violence. It's not just through the lens of death. We need to think about it through the mechanisms of distress, of trauma, of sitting in a publicly funded classroom where, Black history is not taught, where Black history is not named, where you identify as a consciously Black child and never see that in the context of your curriculum. That is a form of, to me, the ways in which we're thinking we need to sort of reconceptualize and think about the violence of the state and the traumatic ways in which state power and resources are operating in a way that position people for that kind of premature death that others have talked about. So I definitely think this is the backdrop of both of these things, the police violence that's been there, but also the ways in which COVID-19 is sort of providing a different kind of lens to see and to create, I think, a broader critique of the impact of state power is a really sort of interesting lens that I think we have to definitely take in around this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think George Floyd actually is a great link for that, because of course, he was killed by the police, but also was later found to be positive for COVID-19, right? And so that's a direct link of sort of a different kind of state violence. If it hadn't been, I forget the name of the officer who killed him, but whatever. If it hadn't been him, it would have been this other thing. So, I mean, I think that's exactly what's happening here as well. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe we can move just really quickly to talk about specifically some of the demonstrations and protests that have happened in recent weeks, kind of since the death of George Floyd. But I think, for what I'll say in terms of the French context is I think it's also helpful to keep in mind that this is part of a larger anti-racist struggle. And, I've been doing participant observation, ethnography at a variety of different protests and demonstrations against different incidents of police violence, including the death of Adama Traoré. And of course, there have been two very massive demonstrations in the last couple of weeks in Paris as it relates to George Floyd. So I think we can maybe think about, or we should talk about why George Floyd is having such a resonance across Europe at this particular moment.
Right. Well, I think it's partly just because of the convergence of events. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of friends about, why now, why this, and I think COVID-19 is a big part of it. We've all been, having to shelter in place, stay at home. Our normal life, activities have been disrupted, and so people are, in a sense, it's almost created a solidarity of we're all stuck at home, and I think that has then led people seeing, particularly here in the U.S., African Americans are disproportionately impacted. That partially raised a certain awareness, and then with the George Floyd, but it's not just George Floyd, right? It was like an entire week of being bombarded with these images, violent images, including the Central Park, situation with the woman and the Black man birder
Yeah.
I mean, that I think opened a lot of people's eyes to the way that police and race can be used to attack somebody by somebody who has white privilege. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was that convergence of things that really led to, and obviously we'll be studying this for years, but I think, for a lot of people, and especially for a lot of white people, because these protests are very multicultural. And also keep in mind that Asian people were being attacked because of, it's the Chinese virus. Right. And so I think that was another component of solidarity.
Yeah. I think, one of the things for me that I've been sort of trying to think about is trying to historicize the role of technology in all of this, and the circulation of these images, the fact that and the sort of irony of social distancing at a moment when technology actually makes it possible to almost see some of these things in real time. And so I think that's something that's interesting. I think another thing as well about, and I'm not going to say that it's just George Floyd at all, but I will say one of the things to me about thinking about police violence, particularly in an American context, although that story isn't new, what to me, or I don't know, what seems to be a bit different about this is it doesn't involve a gun. It literally is the use of your body in a particular kind of way. And so that is something that anyone anywhere could imagine someone sort of, using a disproportionate amount of force to actually extract death. And so there's a way in which kind of the proliferation of guns in the United States oftentimes becomes oh gosh, you guys, have so many guns. Now, granted, that doesn't absolve, any other nation of its disproportionate crime rates or anything like that. But that also becomes that kind of easy way to say that this is sort of an American exceptionalism. And to me, there's a way in which it doesn't involve this gun. It involves, someone who's cool, calm, and collected, clearly not responsive to a threat, but still is acting with that type of impunity. And for me, that scene is something that is quite different from the kind of common narrative that we have about the persistence of racialized police violence in the U.S. context. And like I said, I mean, we've said this before again, the fact that we are kind of plugged into different kinds of technologies in certain kinds of way in this moment just sort of exacerbates all of that. But those are definitely some of the things that I've just been sort of thinking about.
No, sorry to cut you off. No, I completely agree. I've been thinking about this too, specifically with the death of George Floyd, because I think, his last words were sort of, "I can't breathe." And that was very similar to the last words of Adama Traoré, who was killed by the police in July 2016, right? And so I do think there is you know, I mean, I think that people are paying attention to sort of all incidents of police violence in the United States. I mean, Black people globally, but I do think there is something about like the actual specific police techniques that are resonating and the actual things that like, oh, this actually did happen in France, or a very similar version of this happened in France, right? Or this could happen in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think there's something definitely about the specific technique, for lack of a better word, which he died. And then I think there also is helpful to keep in mind I agree with your point about the social media and as sort of feeding a lot of this, right? And I think that was happening before this moment. I mean, just in my research, I've noticed that's definitely happened before this moment in France. Yeah. I think it's also helpful to think about, again, like when we're, you know, in the middle of a pandemic, we're sort of expected to stay home or isolate or whatever, like at least for me, I'm spending more time on social media. And so like there's a way in which these images are circulated or getting more attention at this moment. Hi, Erik.
Hi, Jean. I turned my camera on at just a nice break point there.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I throw some questions at you guys from the audience? And let me just mention to the audience, we now have about 40 questions. So I'm not going to be able to pose all of them. By all means, keep putting them in the Q&A box. What I'm going to try to do is summarize a few of the themes. There are actually many, many themes, but a few of the themes that you guys can take them where you want to go. I would say one common theme is a question about the effects of the lack of data, excuse me, or different ways to use language, lack of acknowledgements of race and racism in Europe. So does it make a difference that there are no figures on the number of Black people working in hospitals in France during the COVID-19 crisis? How does colorblindness as a trope limit discussions about race and racism in France? What does it mean that there's no sociological term for race in German discourse? These are the kinds of questions that a number of people are asking. Another kind of theme, sorry, just to follow up on that, one final kind of question with an outcome focus is, does it matter that there are some countries that actually use the term race, like Britain, and others that don't, like France or Germany or Denmark or other places? There's a question about how themes of race and racism apply to groups like Muslims. So are Muslims being racialized? Is it a similar kind of problem, a very different kind of problem, different or similar challenges? How does that play out in terms of other groups? There are a number of questions about European race scholarship and transatlantic connections based on race. So one commenter notes that it may be more possible for Black American scholars to prosper in the academy than in Europe. Another wonders if there are political networks being built between Black women in the US and in Europe. Another asks, does it matter that foundational US race texts are being used in European countries by activists? Malcolm X, Angela Davis, often cited in Spain. And then I'm just going to throw one more out there, because there's plenty for the next 18 minutes just there. But one more theme of questions was about the politics of memory and commemoration. So the destruction of the statue of Victor Schluter in Martinique, questions about the politics of memory regarding the Holocaust and how that shapes how German governments have conceptualized race and do or don't want to talk about different things. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. I'll keep collecting questions. I'll look for other themes. If there's another opening, I'll jump back in.
Okay, great, thank you.
If you don't mind, can I start on the term race? Because that's a really interesting one. I mean, what started the research on my book, Legislating Equality, is the fact that in 2000, after the Jörg Haider's party, the Freedom Party, was successful in Austria, all of a sudden, France and Germany and all the other 14 EU countries started using the term race because they created the Racial Equality Directive. And I was like, whoa, what happened? All of a sudden, these countries that had refused to use the term race besides the UK were using it, and especially France and Germany. So that was an interesting turn. And there was still a lot of controversy around that in so many different ways. So, but just to touch on the issue of the racialization of Muslims, that's been an interesting, trend. So when I was studying this stuff in the mid 1990s, you didn't hear them talk about Muslims. It was more Algerians and Turkish people. Then, as the rise of the radical right was happening, and there came this, group identity of oh, she's Muslim. And along with that, I saw a lot more women wearing the scarves and more Muslim type clothing and so on, especially in places like Belgium and France and so on. So it's been an interconnected thing as well in terms of identity and the terminology, partly because of the 9/11 and other terror attacks. So we can't discount the impact that had on the group identity around Muslims in Europe as well as the U.S.
Yeah, just to pick up a little bit on that. I mean, I think the discourse is now in terms of public policy in the UK is sort of thinking about Islamophobia as a form of racism and having that sort of recognized in policymaking circles.
Right.
When you're thinking about hate crime legislation and things like that. I have a number of colleagues who are doing some work on that at De Montfort. So that is a very sort of live conversation in a way in which people are sort of, and scholars are sort of, part of that discourse around sort of having that acknowledged as a form of racism. And sort of then what does that then mean in terms of what the policy should look like around protections or around that as a kind of a category of the ways in which injustice is experienced. One of the things I did want to pick up on is the data question. And I think, again, I'm going to sort of stay in my lane in the UK. There was recently a Public Health England report that's gotten a lot of scrutiny in the news, first about sort of the ways in which, we knew that it was going to sort of give us data about disproportionalities, the experience among Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities in the UK. And then there was, conversation about what aspects of the report were redacted and now sort of brought back into the mix. And part of that data was about, part of the data that was left out was about data that was sort of talking about the social determinants of health, whereas the previous report was giving us data that was going to reinforce very 19th century eugenics notions about, the ways in which certain kinds of racialized bodies are inherently prone to certain kinds of health outcomes, which we know, only reifies a kind of biological notion of race that gets us absolutely nowhere and is absolutely false in any kind of way that we see it. But I think the other thing too that I've just sort of been thinking about is that the categories that we work with in the UK, no one that I know that falls in the category of BAME like embraces that term as a way of actually describing their lived experience, their history, their heritage, all their community relations. Like, that doesn't map onto anything recognizable. However, it's BME, it's BAME that becomes the category of data collection when it comes to, making policy decisions and describing, trying to figure out where public health resources are going to go and social service resources are going to go. And so to me, there's a real danger between, not having sort of lived racial and ethnic categories to collect data about racial disparities and the way that racism works. There's a real sort of tension there. And, Boris Johnson's just announced another race report as if we need to study more about race and like, we know it exists. Don't spend the resources there and the resources, on actually doing something about it. So I do think, there definitely is that question. And I'm going to really slide in really quickly because I think the point about Black scholars, I'm again going to focus on the UK. I just want to be clear, there are less than 100 Black professors in the UK, around 30 Black women professors, and here professors is in the American context would be the full rank professor, a professor at full professor rank, but those are dire, desperate numbers. And so there's a need to not only address representation, but there's a need to address pathways into that. And that's definitely some of the work that our center is really, just really sort of dedicated to trying to address, is how do we create pathways into academia to have a more diverse and representative academic landscape. The university that I work with is 54% Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. student population, 37% Black students there. The academic staff needs to have more reflection around, what that looks like and what that means to actually serve a student population that looks like. And we're not the only minority serving institution in the UK. As the undergraduate student populations are changing, we're not seeing that pace of change happen in the rate of academic staff representation, particularly at the higher ranks of the academy in the UK. And that to me is a real problem. It's a real problem globally, but it is especially acute in terms of the UK academy.
Yeah, and France and Germany are even worse.
So. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, so thank you for that. No, I mean, I think just to kind of go back to this question, go quickly to this question of sort of academic representation. I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's a little bit, sometimes it feels a little awkward for me as a Black American sociologist to say, oh, we do it so much better than other places, but like we actually do. I mean, it just sort of feels weird to say it that way, but like I do understand and have been informed by, my French colleagues who are trying to study race and Blackness, how difficult it is to have that kind of academic space, to have that kind of academic language, that kind of support for that kind of work. So for example, there was a day-long conference on whiteness in France a couple of years ago in Paris. And it was amazing that it happened, and that was like a really big deal, but it also got a lot of pushback in the media for even sort of acknowledging that whiteness or white supremacy exists in France, right? And so, so I am very heartened by the fact that these are still very difficult conversations to have in places outside of the United States. And I think it also sort of maps onto, particularly in the context of France, if the French Republican ideology sees individuals just as individuals and doesn't acknowledge race, that of course maps onto the French academic space as well, right? And so like there's a way in which like French academia has only sort of reinforced a lot of these sort of ideas of a disavowal of race in broader French society. And so, so that gets into the question also of sort of just how colorblindness limits the discussion of racism in France, right? And sort of, I think when you, or at least my experience is doing ethnographic work in France and collecting interview data in France, people tend to be like, okay, so what is like someone who's Maghreban, or what does that actually mean? And, usually when I ask people themselves, they know exactly what it means. So, I mean, I think this kind of goes to kind of your point around sort of the distinction between the categories that maybe, us as scholars use or academics use versus what people on the ground understand in terms of their actual lived realities of being non-white and what that, and the currency that has, even if, the state itself or society itself says there is no currency. The other point I want to quickly get on, touch on is this question around the racialization of Muslims, which I think is very important in Europe and generally, particularly in France, which has relative to other European countries, has a large concentration of Muslims. And I think one of the things that happens, and this also sort of feeds into the question or the point around colorblindness and the Republican ideology, is the ways in which, because you can't talk about racial and ethnic categories or name racial and ethnic categories in French society, it nonetheless is acceptable to sort of have this kind of catch-all Muslim other category. And so I think especially in recent years, thinking about sort of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the November 2015 attacks in Paris, right? It's like becomes much more acceptable discourse to sort of blame all societal problems on Muslims, even though, in my own work, I found that there's a huge variation in what being Muslim means to French Muslims, right? So it's not this sort of, there's a lot of sort of heterogeneity that's missed by having this sort of catch-all category, but I think part of what's happening in that context is that Muslims becomes a sort of racialized category. And I would quickly shout out my colleague Jennifer Fredette's book, Constructing Muslims, which kind of gets at this as well. And then of course, I think this also is very linked to ongoing work on the racialization of Muslims here in the United States. I think there's a French specificity or a European specificity to these questions, but there also is a sort of global Islamophobia that I think is doing a lot of this work as well. And then I also wanted to quickly touch on the point around sort of American text being used in France or being used in Europe, because that's also something that I found in my work in terms of my respondents being very aware of, the autobiography of Malcolm X or the work of Angela Davis, more so than, the work of Frantz Fanon. And I think that gets to, among other things, Kennetta, the point you made earlier around sort of, the sort of learning or the education of Black history and the ways in which that's not part of in the context of France, that's not part of the French official curriculum, right? So, people sort of seek out these sources elsewhere and don't sort of aren't as easily exposed to, I mean, they sort of expose themselves to this, but they're not easily exposed to, Aimé Césaire, Fanon, these other thinkers in the French context. And so I think that's part of what's happening in sort of painting this particular kind of French national narrative that sort of obfuscates these other sort of figures. Hi, Erik.
Hi, could I jump in with a couple more sets of questions? We now have almost 70 questions. So again, just reinforcing the point that we're not going to be able to cover.
You're speaking very, very fast. Yeah,
exactly. So there are at least kind of 3 more themes that are commonly coming up in the Q&A thread. One of them has to do with capitalism and how kind of the capitalist society affects some of the dynamics that we're seeing. And then a couple of more are really focused on sort of what's going to change now, in particular in the era of COVID-19. So one of the sets of questions is about, do we think that racial disparities will now be more visible and therefore there will be more protests, more actions, more possibilities for change? Or do we think that closing the borders targets immigrants and minorities for further stigmatization? The other theme also has to do with the consequences, but it's more of the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. So is there a window of opportunity for breaking with the tradition of the denial of racism in Europe now in a way that has never been possible before? What do you see as the prospects for change in countries that you are most familiar with? Will there be a possibility of these countries reaching across their borders and developing a movement in Europe and perhaps linking to movements beyond in the United States, globally, et cetera?
Let's just start first.
Oh,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Kennetta.
I was going to take the more sort of, I like the idea of thinking about where we are in terms of, to borrow from Adam Gedeshu, it's a world-making moment, like that this context is creating through the visibility, and I'm glad that was brought up, because I do think that we're seeing things that were already in motion, but they are now more visible to a wider audience. It's not that these issues weren't being raised. It's not that this type of organizing wasn't happening. It's not that these types of demands weren't already on the table within communities. It's the visibility of them that gives them a different kind of ability to sort of have another level of being able to be heard, being able to be translated, being able to be understood, being able to provide a basis for coalition building, for the recognition of solidarities. And so I really do see, see us in the context of a kind of a world-making moment where we're raising questions about, we have this debate in my household all the time about what it means to defund the police or to abolish the police. Right. And what I love about that is it is forcing an imagination of what it means to think differently about policing and public safety and the accountability that it should have with communities, both in the U.S., but also globally. And so I do think, I'm appreciative of, the debate over the removal of statues, that those are long-held campaigns in places like Bristol, where they've been debating, folks' legacy, like Colston. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing sort of, the visibility around that is creating a moment where it's like, yeah, of course, we're going to get rid of the statue. Not to say that it just falls down, but these things become, the possibility of these things become, and the possibility of change around these things and the possibility of transformation around these things becomes, much more thinkable, much more possible. And so I am kind of, heartened, and, as much as this moment is sort of a lot to wrap your head around with, I do think it is a moment where we're seeing, those kinds of imaginings of alternative futures, and we're seeing in real time the actual steps that are being taken to actually bring that future into being. And for me, that's a really powerful conjuncture to think through.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the question about capitalism. I think we are seeing a stronger critique of capitalism, the fact that it's created the inequalities we're seeing that are leading to the disparities. And so it's going to be very interesting to see politically how that plays out. I mean, you can see here in the US that, kind of the more left-leaning politics of people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren is having an impact on our presidential election. Hard to say the impact that's going to have at the congressional level, but I'm curious to see the impact this has in Europe in terms of more left-leaning parties, to see if there's any kind of resurgence of the left because of this stronger critique of capitalism and the inequalities that it has created. We'll have to see how that plays out, because we've seen, unfortunately, a stronger resurgence of even far-right parties, although that's kind of up and down. But in any case, I'll stop there because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, I'll just quickly kind of go back to the point that Ken made about sort of imagining different possibilities. I mean, I think, I'm not generally an optimistic person, which I always joke is sort of great about being a sociologist, because you don't have to be. But I do think one thing that's been interesting that I've noticed, particularly in the last couple of weeks, is a somewhat of a more acceptable conversation about, racism within France. So, for example, I was part of a radio program a couple of weeks ago about sort of answering the question, does racism exist in France, or is racism sort of rooted in France? And on some level, I feel like this is a kind of basic question, but it is nonetheless, somewhat revelatory that is something that people can even talk about in a mainstream forum. So, when I am feeling hopeful, I try to cling to moments like that, even though I tend to not be a super optimistic person. But I do think there is something that's happening around, that there even are traces of mainstream conversations around these topics, however basic, I think is a sign of some future change. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all so much for this webinar. It was fantastic. And I will say that probably a third to a half of the comments in the Q&A thread lead with, what a fantastic webinar. So thank you all for taking the time to be here today. And thanks to everybody who watched. This is recorded. It will be on the Council for European Studies website later today or tomorrow. You'll be getting I believe a survey about participation. So please answer that if you have a few moments, and stay tuned for future CES webinars. Thanks very much again to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. This was really fun.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.